All right, everyone, welcome to this special video. I hope you are excited and sort of keen for what is about to take place, because right now we are having a special discussion with Mrs. Okay, Mrs. Bronwyn Williams.
That sounds terrible.
As we are in the education sphere, you know, titles are all the rage. So that's why I use that. But we've got Bronwyn Williams with us, who is a business analyst and economist and futurist and all these good ists. She will tell you more about herself now. Bronwyn, the floor is yours to give us a brief introduction about who you are and what you do.
Okay, sure. So I have a partner at a company called Flux Trends, and there I work basically doing foresight or helping businesses to unpack what's going to be happening likely in the future and how they can react to that in a bit more of a proactive manner. So what I actually do is a sort of a combination between actually sort of marketing, economics, and future studies, which is quite an interesting intersection. But what it all has in common is really I'm trying to understand incentives. That is why we make the choices that we do and how to actually change other people's choices. And then also constraints or trade-offs, trying to understand what are the consequences and unintended consequences of the choices that we're making or failing to make today. So really the role of someone in my sort of field, in the futures field, it's not really so much to predict what's going to happen as to explore what is possible to happen, and then to actually facilitate some sort of change to make sure that what is likely to happen doesn't end up happening exactly the way it would fall out if we weren't being involved and being more directed as to what comes next, if that makes sense.
Okay, cool. So it's basically preparing adequately for what is projected to be.
Yeah, so it's about preparing. It's about trying to avoid mistakes, so to avoid threats, and then also to take advantage of opportunities. So it's really about taking ownership of what's going to happen next, rather than being a sort of passive recipient, as I like to say, of someone else's future, which tends to be an all too common phenomenon in this world. When you start hearing words like inevitable thrown around and this will happen, and you know that's very sort of disempowering, whether you're talking about sort of futures from an individual perspective or from an organizational perspective or even a national perspective. It's about instilling some sort of agency, and that understanding that what we do and the choices that we make do facilitate change, and that all the little things we do, whether we're voting with our vote as citizens or whether we're voting with our wallets, which we do multiple times a day, so we've got plenty of opportunities to vote with our cash every day, that we're voting for the sorts of things that we want. So those are the sorts of conversations we like to have. Of course, this applies to, as I said, individuals all the way up to organizations. It's about being proactive, not sort of reactive, passive recipients of other people's decisions.
Like there's some preordained path we just all have to go along. So have you been classically trained? Did you study anywhere? If so, what did you study?
Yeah, so okay, my career started out in marketing. I studied commerce first, so I did a BCom, and I worked in marketing for two very different companies. I worked around 5 years at each of them. Firstly, I was like a classical brand and marketing manager for a small company called McNabb's. They sell energy products, but it was a very involved role. So I had a small business. I was involved in really the strategic part of building that business on trying to grow it to international level. And that gave me quite a solid understanding of how the sort of FMCG and basic business environment works. That was a great role to start off in. And the next company that I worked for, also in a marketing role, but I was selling then very different goods. I was selling information. So we were selling macro and microeconomic analysis to retail investors, which was a very nice bridge into the sort of futures and incentive driven sort of space, because essentially if you can sell ideas, the next step, of course, is to start contributing some of those ideas. So you're selling your own ideas, not necessarily everyone else's. And at the same time, around about that time, I also went back to school, and I've got postgrad degrees in both foresight and future studies and in economics. So I sort of tied that all together. So what I really found was that marketing gives you actually quite a good basis to explore the future, because marketing really is all to do with persuading people, so changing behavior on a very micro level, but you can apply those same techniques to selling ideas. I said, and ideas are what change the world. As old Keynes said, like defunct economists tend to sort of dictate the world that we live in. And future studies is, of course, very interesting, but it's quite theoretical. And because it's quite a new field, academically speaking, in some ways it lacks a bit of rigor to make it practical. And economics bridges the gaps between that very, very nicely from an academic point of view. I certainly found that whether you're studying things like game theory or cause and effect or supply and demand, those principles translate into pretty much any choice or any sort of decision that you're trying to understand the impact of. So when you tie all those thinkings together, it gives you quite a nice sort of framework to understand how people think, how people actually change their behavior, why things happen, what consequences and unintended consequences mean, but also sort of putting it together with the more philosophical side of future studies, which is more about thinking about consequences and also thinking about what is possible. So it's much more exploratory. It's much less rigorous. You can't test really a hypothesis in future studies because the whole point is being essentially a contemporary or secular prophet. Your role is to change the future, not actually to predict it. So I kind of like to say economists predict the future, but futurists really don't, or at least shouldn't. And if they're getting it right, then they're also getting their jobs wrong because you're not facilitating change if what you say ends up happening exactly as it comes to pass. Then of course, what's your purpose in the corporate sphere or in the public sector if you're not helping people to change what is said to be, as you say, quote unquote, inevitable or not. So that's basically what I did. So from marketing to sort of marketing financial products to getting into the trends and futures space is not a huge jump when you look at it in that direction. And what you'll find people that work in the future space do tend to come either from the creative industry. So often quite a lot of people in there from sort of marketing, comms, advertising space, and also quite a lot of people that actually have an academic background in economics for some reason because of the way thinking works. Those tend to attract those sorts of people, and or just people that have been professional career sort of foresight or futurist academics from day one. But we can maybe talk about that a bit later, but it's what you find there with people that have been purely through the sort of academic journey in that space. What you find quite quickly is to apply the sorts of ideas and to articulate the sorts of ideas and models that you're taught in a sort of academic futures career or subject matters training, is that those models are only as good as the information you put into them. And that's often what's lacking with people that don't have real world experience or experience from other industries. They're unable to fill their own models. So it's an interesting sort of way when you start talking about these things, is that futures is open space, but it requires a good general knowledge and a deep general knowledge too.
So it's you strike me as someone who's really passionate about what they do. And I think in this conversation, I usually start my students off on a very sort of black pill level by saying, you know what, I feel like traditional schooling has failed all of us in many ways. So I like that you're presenting now that breaking down of the proverbial silos that everyone sort of traditionally works in and having a more general knowledge base to pull from is actually advantageous in, the information age, where we're kind of in the post-information age, because if you look at trends and things, I think you can comment on that for sure.
Yeah, so education is an interesting one. And I think that we have done ourselves a disservice as society in trying to conflate knowledge with skills training. So we've tried and we've actually worked very, very hard to remove the borders between people that are like being trained to do a particular job and people that are engaging in study for the accumulation of knowledge's sake in and of itself. So knowledge is an end. And we've conflated that, and we've turned like technical apprenticeships into degree programs. And that's created fat. It's created waste of time for everyone. It's added costs to these programs, but without getting actual return on investment for students. At the same time, what we've done is we've watered down traditional like university knowledge, which was about accumulating knowledge for knowledge's sake. In other words, a body of people who are not there to get a job in a field, but rather to actually work on problems, whether they be social problems or scientific problems, whatever that may be, to sort of add to the body of knowledge in society. So I'm quite skeptical for sort of credentialized sort of skills training, but at the same time, I think that there is going to reemerge an opportunity to create spaces for academic thought's sense itself. So I have invested quite a lot of my own money in higher education, even though I'm very, very skeptical of it. My motivations for study have been personal development, not in order to collect pieces of paper that impress people to pay me a salary. So I think that we are starting to see that split, and we can see the signposts unrolling actually quite fast. And it's happening because that return on investment of higher education, for those two reasons, we've watered down the value of both those sectors or sort of segments or reasons to have knowledge. And we've seen that ROI is just simply not useful anymore, whether you're talking about return on investment from a sort of a physical perspective or from a physical perspective. The return on time we're investing in these programs is not translating into gains in either knowledge or personal future growth and development, which is why most people go and study it, so they can get a job and improve their own lifestyle.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
By conflating that, we are wasting a lot of money, and we're almost getting to a point, which I know is quite a controversial topic, but where we can actually start to say that there's sort of diminishing marginal returns to education as a social good. And I'm talking not education as in knowledge, we have to separate that, but education as in credentialized, formalized knowledge that is being used essentially as a gatekeeping into careers. I mean, it's quite ridiculous that you get to a point where Starbucks will ask you for a formal degree before you can go work there to pour coffee.
It's pretty ridiculous.
You created a bureaucracy out of something that was supposed to be a social good. And there's all sorts of sort of studies there in terms of things like elite overproduction and the sort of dangers of expectations on people who spend large amounts of money on pieces of paper that are not going to translate into what they think they're getting. So there's like an advertising challenge when it comes to higher education. But there's also, we've got to be careful to say that these things have value, but they're not being packaged and sold in ways that are actually translating into value for individuals that are investing their time in these programs, or into societies that are increasingly funding them. I mean, we start talking about student debt forgiveness, we failed, because if education is valuable, that should never be an issue, right? You should be better off than someone who hasn't been able to get a degree at all.
100%.
But if that's not translating, the cost and the value equation is clearly broken and needs to be repackaged and probably, as I'm suggesting, separated in that skills training, even white collar skills training, like to go work in a consulting firm, for example. That's a skills training that you're getting with your MBA. And we think of MBA as being like an academic program, but it's not. You're not accumulating knowledge to contribute to the body of knowledge. You're accumulating that program to get a better job, to increase your paycheck. Yeah. And those sorts of programs, we have to start sort of reconsidering the sort of what is a public good when it comes to education, particularly if states are funding it and societies are funding it through debt and through loans and grants, and what is actually a private good that should be funded by the private sector. And that's why your sort of institutions like your Lambda School and your We Think Code are probably the future of professional skills training, which is very different from academic knowledge accumulation, which is more of a social good and probably should have some sort of social funding, because essentially then you're separating the profit motive from the production motive, which is, I think, a much more exciting way to look at these things going forward.
Yeah, you bring up things that make me think about social capital theory and and actually the cost and price of losing meritocracy, in that, getting into university used to be a really prestigious thing, whereas, the lowering of standards over decades has just changed the complete how we think about knowledge and how we think about education, because we have people speaking about education as a human right and all these kind of things that we can talk on, but I'd rather move on to what I really want to discuss with you today. So I want to talk about big tech and social media as kind of the bullseye on the dartboard that we're trying to target. So in looking at big tech and considering social media in the modern age, everything is so hegemonic. So largely we've got American hegemony. I know the Brits like to say hegemony. It's very strange. That's one of the weirdest pronunciation things, but the hegemony coming from America. So it's this imported sort of cultural, economic, societal sort of these norms and practices. Do you think that it's fair to say that the biggest in the big tech industry, so we're talking Apple's, we're talking Twitter, Facebook, Amazon, and the like, that are largely American-based companies, are we sort of controlled by these technocrats, or at least is the information of the flow of information controlled?
Well, I think there's many ways to answer that question. Firstly, I think we need to sort of establish up front that from my perspective, when you start talking about these big companies, we start very quickly talking about things like monopolies over access to whatever it is, whether it's communication flows or censorship, whatever the case may be. And I think it's important to note that there really are no monopolies in this world of ours that aren't endorsed at some level or backed by regulation of some sort, backed by a state of some sort, because this is the source of all monopoly, is having a monopoly on force at the state level. So no conversation about big tech is, for me, worthwhile having unless we're also mentioning the ties to big government, which is when it starts becoming very, that's when it becomes a lot more dangerous. And I think that's what we're really starting to see unfold now. And I'm not even sure that the blame should lie specifically with the big tech companies, but rather with society that sort of forced them into a position they don't necessarily want to act in. So you've always got to kind of look at where's the reaction coming from and where's the action coming from, and what was the cause, what was the effect. And the dangers of these very big tech companies having, as you say, sort of control over information flows are only dangerous when they actually do start controlling your information flows. So if we're using them voluntarily and we can switch from a Facebook to a TikTok, I mean, like, that's the other thing. People say that, Facebook's got a monopoly on attention. Well, if it does, then how does TikTok exist? Like what happened to MySpace? These were institutions, as big as they are, that we supported and then we can stop supporting at any time. And we have done in the past. This is what happens with networks. They grow very quickly, but they tend to implode very quickly too. And as much as Facebook is, which is an interesting case study over here, has been like the scapegoat, the bad boy of social media, number one, public enemy number one, quite frankly, it was already dying. I mean, their consumer base is more baby boomer than like Gen Z. So it would have died eventually anyway, just because of the cool factor and the fact that young people are not adopting it. So it was perhaps, like, we have to understand those sort of market scales. And those market events where the bigger you are, the quicker you fall. This is classic economies of scale and like overshoot and overgrowth and all of that happen easier. In other words, big companies are disseminated and destroyed quicker the less regulation there is around them. And there's great parallels here with what happens in the financial sector and the banking industry, which is one of the most regulated institutions and industries in the world. Regulation essentially preserves the market dynamics that we have rather than allows the market to eat its own. So we have to choose. And I'm not making like a moral judgment whether sort of picking and choosing winners and losers from a top-down perspective is better than a sort of a much more sort of state of nature where the market eats its own and big companies are eaten by the next big company, by the next big thing. In and of themselves, there's obviously pros and cons to all of that. But we have to understand firstly that currently in a democracy, where there is a separation between big business and big states, at least by law, even if not necessarily in practice, these things are not monopolies. So we do have choices. We can vote with our time. We can opt to switch to a different platform. And people say that's impossible. It's absolutely not. How many millions of people switched from WhatsApp to Signal overnight just because the narrative changed? No one forced them to. This was a bottom-up revolution of the consumer that shows these things can be defeated without regulation. They can be defeated purely by market sentiment. So we kind of have to have that context. However, we're facing quite a dangerous point in time right now when these companies, as they do become more regulated and as regulators, and in fact as populations, have forced these platforms to adopt the role of regulation and centralization and censorship of communications, that's when they become a lot more dangerous. But this was not a role that these companies wanted to have. They're profit-orientated businesses who make more money from polarizing views, who make more money from hosting unpopular people than they do from censoring them. But what we're seeing now is that being afraid of regulation, they now expect essentially operating as a branch of government. They're trying to anticipate regulation and in fact then therefore become what they don't want to become, if that makes any sense. So in order to anticipate regulation, in order to prevent regulation, they end up acting the same way they would have acted if they were regulated in the first place. And that's what we're starting to see. And that's when it becomes a lot more of a problem. But again, I would say the red herring layer is the sort of social media platform layer. The real problems when you start to see private companies acting as judge, jury, and executioner, acting as arbiters of truth, acting as censors of the flow of information, the social media layer is not particularly concerning to me. I know that's probably an unpopular opinion, but as I mentioned, we can switch platforms, and it's not particularly difficult. We're not locked in there with our credit cards and all these sorts of things. We have choice. We don't have to use it. There are options. We can build our own networks. The problem is in the deeper stack layers, when you've got ISP providers that have been granted a monopoly by states to allow flows of information to flow. When those layers start censoring things, when the deeper platform layers start interfering with flows of information, then we're in very big trouble. Because essentially, if you've been granted a monopoly license, whether that's a monopoly license to provide water or to have access to spectrum at the Wi-Fi level, whatever that case is, that's a scarce resource. And if you and the other people essentially in that sort of mandated oligarchy all make the same decision, suddenly you have a power of law and order over the marketplace. And you're acting as a sort of pseudo-governmental agency rather than really as a market participant. Because market participants, as I've tried to illustrate, can be taken out by other market participants. Yeah. Oligarchies that have been granted moats to operate in cannot be taken out by market forces because there only are 3 cell phone providers you can use or 3 Wi-Fi, spectrum providers you're allowed to access through. If they coordinate, or if they're acting in coordination with the state power in a less sort of democratic state, then you do have de facto censorship that is effectively backed by law, which becomes very, very scary. And that's where we should be directing our attention. So I do tend to find the conversations around sort of social media platforms bad to be quite distracting from the real issues that we should be thinking about. And we should be asking ourselves quite carefully whether we want social networks or at any level of the stack to be moving closer towards centers of power, or if we want to be separating those centers of power. Because for me, it's much more dangerous to have every platform or whatever service that is acting in sync than it is to have many different platforms making terrible decisions. I don't care who Twitter censors and who they kick off their platform. It's a private platform. They can do what they like. But if you have a limited choice of service providers, that's a very different conversation. So that's sort of, maybe that opens my point. Maybe you can unpack that and interrogate where you got holes there.
No, you bring up some good points. I mean, you're firstly bringing up the agency of the user, which I think from my school, the computer science and information systems, we largely like to, in all the textbooks and all the printed materials are, let's focus on the end user experience. That's why UI and UX are such massive industries and fields. And we always like to tout that, but is that really the goal at the end of the day? It's like you say, it's like the conversation has been steered towards, let's talk about censorship and things of this nature, instead of, understanding our own power in us deciding, what transpires. And I like what you said about Facebook dying as well, because before Trump, Twitter was also trending down. I mean, their financial situation in 2015 was terrible. So having a largely unpopular figure really helped them.
Yeah, absolutely. But we have to understand social networks are exactly that. They are social networks, and they grow up around communities. And in particular, they grow up around generational cohorts. This is the same with cities, whether you're talking about like a sort of streets that are popular with a particular generation will be off-putting to their children. So when your parents move like physically into town or into a particular platform, young people disappear and they form their own networks. So there's natural market dynamics tend towards social networks achieving massive, economies of scale, because that's when they start to be successful. But then at almost that exact same point, much like sort of water hyacinths overshooting their boundaries on a pond, they implode quite quickly. And people are wanting to connect in different spaces. And we see new social networks popping up. Many of them don't succeed. And of course, in this sort of game, the biggest ones succeed outscale. But it's the same with rock stars. On any sort of rock star profession, there's always a few big people that take, more than the sort of 80%, 80-20 Pareto sort of scale gains in any sort of these rock star industries. Of course, it's much more magnified, much more sort of skewed bell curves over there. But they don't last forever. New waves come. And I think that we perhaps don't always have enough patience. We also don't necessarily understand that we like to rail against these things that we've invited in. I mean, like you can just leave.
Yeah, That's
you be there. And you can take your best friends with you, you know, like you actually know real people. You say, we're going to Clubhouse now. You can do that, right?
Do we still know real people, or is it all just,
or your
you know,
your favorite anonymous accounts, you know,
oh, there
your
we
group,
go.
your
That's
tribe.
it.
You can say, we're going, us, on this WhatsApp group, we're moving to Signal. And that opportunity is always available to you. But we resist it. We like, instead of saying, I can go, you say, I want to regulate it to stop anyone else from being able to use it too. And that's quite disturbing from a sort of macro social perspective. This whole sort of, it's essentially an envy drive where it's like, I don't want to take on the cost if no one else is going to take on the cost of change or moving. So I kind of want to force everyone to move with me so that I'm not the only person taking a risk or taking on the cost. There's many parallels to sort of what's happened with sort of corona management over the last year, but we don't have to go into that. But that whole sort of like, I don't want to be the only one to do it. I want everyone to have to move with me is not a productive, you know, drive in society. And it's something that I think we should be calling out a little bit more. But like documentaries like the social dilemma just absolutely give me hives, because the lack of agency that is being portrayed there is demoralizing for people. So it makes people feel paralyzed and helpless, but it's also not entirely true. It doesn't articulate the full story that's going on. And I'm not defending and saying these companies are good. I firmly believe they're all amoral and out for exactly as much as they can extract from us. But they also operate within a certain degree of having to serve the user up until a certain point. So if enough of us really had a problem with data collection or with their censorship policies, we could have changed that by simply refusing to engage until they stopped it. It would change it overnight.
100%. I mean, I had a question for you where I said, should these industries have the amount of power and sway they do? But I mean, you've just answered that by saying,
we gave it to them.
Yes, exactly.
No, they shouldn't have that much power, but we shouldn't have given it to them. It's like vampires. That's my favorite analogy. You have to open the door to let the vampire into your house in like pop lore, science fiction and fantasy. That we all know the rules with vampires. But once you've opened the door, they're going to take more than you understood you were going to give them. And I think that's what people are getting frustrated about. And this is where I can find sort of middle ground in these kind of debates and say, yes, we have given more than we thought we were giving. So we gave consent, but we did not give informed consent. And there's much useful conversations to be had about the hidden terms and conditions and disingenuous behavior in that sort of regard. But that's not to say that these platforms require more censorship or regulation from government, rather that government should just be sort of regulating what already exists or enforcing basic contract law, for example. You know?
But I mean, as you've said, you can also see the blend between the private and public sector with the PPE, like you said, the investigations into that. I mean, they've said there are 38 or so. I mean, realistically, if you have a crease or two in your brain, right, you're going to know that we're talking thousands of companies. We're not just talking 38. So, I mean, this blending of those two really goes deeper than I think most people are aware of, because they still like to separate the two.
Absolutely. I mean, if you want to look at all of the biggest problems in our society, it's where corporates are at some level are in bed with public sector in a disingenuous way. In other words, all the biggest problems are where, actually we were speaking about this a bit earlier, basically where private money or where public money is being used to fund private interests. That's where almost all of our biggest problems, whether you're talking about censorship, control, tech platforms, whatever it is. And we can take this conversation even further and talk about how do these platforms get so big in the first place? You might want to kind of look at all the tax rebates that big companies get that the private sector supports. Why is public money being used to support private interests? You know, like we've got to ask those questions. And I do think that most of our problems are in the intersection. And I think that society loves to make things binary or polarized and say corporate bad, government good, or vice versa, government good, corporate bad. But most of the problems are where the two of them are overlapping too much, where we've insufficiently separated the powers of power and wealth. And when you're talking about democracy or capitalism, which is really sort of crony capitalism or sort of socialism for the rich, but capitalism for the poor, you know, like
it's fun money for us and for everyone. You know? It's fun money for us,
but not for we. And like, and you know, corruption and graft, all these things that requires both. So there's blame to be found on both sides. But again, the only way to sort of break that link is for actual citizens to have agency, citizen consumers. I don't know if people hate being called consumers, but when it comes to voting with your wallet, that's the best way to describe you. Sorry, you might be a lovely customer to your company, but when it comes to your market dynamic, use your vote as a consumer.
Yeah, I mean, that's a weird word. It's like civilized. People don't like that word anymore, but I mean, I feel like we need civility more than ever. It's one of those words we've lost, but it's something.
Lost the meaning of the word. They've been bastardized and changed into things that they aren't. The problems we have with democracy in with a capital D are not problems with the idea of democracy. It's problems with the way it's being implemented.
Oh yeah.
Just like the problems we have with capitalism. We talk about capitalism. We don't even understand what capitalism is. We have the things we hate about capitalism are mostly interference. They're actually mostly sort of nationalism or nationalization that's the problem in that. So we have to unpack these terms. And I think there's definitely conversations to be had about reclaiming words for what they mean rather than changing words to fit people's opinions of them, which is what we do all too often. And it creates a lot of confusion and a lot of bad faith arguments and noise. So we can't actually see the problem.
I'm traditionally 100%. I mean, I'm traditionally trained in communication theory, and I lecture that now as well. So I'm very interested in these hidden relationships between phenomena, right? So I mean, that's what you're alluding to now. And speaking about the free market, as that's always what someone says after you say capitalism, that's all they know, is talking about WhatsApp. And recently now in January, they're making a statement saying, okay, we're updating our terms of service and privacy policy. And as we know, WhatsApp is owned by Facebook, the boomer social media. And they were pretty upfront about what their intentions are with our information. So that's the good side of the coin. But I mean, the other side of the coin is from your perspective, is this a trend you think that will continue? Will these companies begin letting us know what their intentions are with our information and our data?
They're going to have to. I think people are starting to wake up. That's the good thing with the whole sort of WhatsApp moral panic, which I can best compare to the sort of moral panic around rock and roll music in the 1980s. I mean, I think the parallels are quite clear from my perspective. But there's a lot of panic, a lot of more moral pill clutching going on right now. Something new about this. And in fact, the very fact that they were so transparent shows that a lot of actual progressive progress, they're trying to be transparent, but now we're going to panic. Meanwhile, this has been going on for a long time. And there are a lot of places that we don't even understand that are taking a lot more of our data and intruding a lot more on our privacy and on our civil liberties in more older, more traditional businesses. Like if you know the data the credit bureaus have on you or what your medical insurer has on you, those are much more scary wells of data than your WhatsApp groups to your lover. I mean, I know you think you're very interesting, but this is not the biggest issue we're facing right now. But what is good about it is that people are starting to understand and to start to take back that agency. So for me, as a sort of social observer, it's encouraging to see people leave, even if they don't fully understand why they're leaving. At least people have realized, they've woken up and said, I actually can do something about this. So I think that's healthy. That's a healthy move and healthy direction we're going in. At the same time, we probably should be concerned that the demands for our data and our personal details are only increasing, and they're increasing from many different levels. And again, I'd say the thing we need to watch out for the most, if we actually are concerned about liberal, like with a small L values, things like liberty and, the ability freedom, to direct your own life, classic stuff like that, the basics, or even equality, whatever your favorites are, we need to be aware that there are nets closing around us where this data sharing is no longer going to be opt-in for many people. It's going to become more and more sort of impossible to opt out. And this is when personal data starts being used for access to monopoly services, not to sort of nice things to have like smoothies from your discovery, like Vitality Point, like that's nice stuff, to get that stuff. But when refusal to share your data means that you're not able to collect your social grant payment, for example. So that doesn't happen in South Africa yet, but it's already happening in places like the United States. In fact, there have been very interesting studies done about how being poor is correlated with losing your privacy. Like, people then track you to make sure that, you are poor enough to get this particular food coupon, for example.
Wow.
And that's hugely disturbing. It's dehumanizing on such a level. And we have to be very, very careful that we don't normalize that sort of trading your secret self for the right to live in society. And I think that's a lot more disturbing to me. But once again, that comes down to that intersection between corporations that hold your data and who they're sharing them with. And as soon as we're talking about monopoly services, we're essentially talking about access to public goods. Yeah. So I think that's, once again, always look for the intersection if you want to look at where the real problems are. And we know this, like what scares people. It's like old Peter Thiel and his like Palantir data. That's scary. That's a private company that knows huge amounts about you that's actually being used to now dictate whether you like to go in and out certain national borders. Those are concerning things that are happening, but they're concerning because they're combining massive information with massive control over how to actually use that information. And then you can get into all the conversations around social credit scores and surveillance money and, central bank digital currencies and what China's doing over there, sort of closing the full Wi-Fi curtain. I'm trying to get that term to take off, so please mention it to all your friends.
I will use that. Yeah.
Curtain, the Wi-Fi curtain. Yes,
that's great.
And it's invisible and it's everywhere. It's not like you can't climb over it. It's everywhere, which is that's when the net really closes. And once again, it's where data that's been collected by companies in that country, like Ant Financial, has been sort of shared with state institutions and used to limit access to basic goods and services and the ability to live your life as an individual with agency. Yeah. And that's why agency is my message, because the more we outsource these things, the wider you open the door to the various different vampires, the tighter that net sort of pulls. And you find that it's quite easy to give agency. It's very, very difficult to take it back. It's like losing weight. It's much easier just to stay skinny than it is to try and like lose it after you've put on a few kilos. So.
Oh yeah, for sure. No, something you brought up now just makes me think of, I study serious games as well. I've written a couple papers on it. So I look at dark design patterns, and how mobile games were like the first real world examples where people would see, oh crap, I have to trade real world time for energy, or I have to trade me watching the shitty Russian ad where people who are speaking a language I do not understand are saying some crazy things. I have to sit and watch that for 30 seconds before I can refill my energy meter. So like dark design patterns, I think, have been going on behind the scenes, and what you're talking about now in like the banks and all these other industries, they've been using these dark design patterns to manipulate us for so long. So I think
dark design is much more accurate than libertarian paternalism, as it's otherwise termed, right?
100%.
Behavioral economics. Yeah, I like yours better.
Yeah, I know. So yeah, you'll notice with me, I like to keep things simple. The simple definition is usually the correct one. That's my thinking. But with this, what good is privacy if, all this is going on? Like, is it something? Because I speak to my wife sometimes, and she's like, I don't care what Facebook has on me. I'm like, what? Even though it's nothing like incredulous or something bad that could destroy her reputation or something like that. Her willingness to just forego agency, I think that's what I'm trying to ask you is, what good is privacy if so many people are willing to just give it up?
Well, I think when it comes to privacy, it's one of those sort of common good type values. It's unfortunately one of those things that you can intrude on my privacy. You can film me and I can film you, and like it requires, it's a common good, which means it requires a common consciousness to be valuable at all. You can't maintain your privacy alone when everyone else has handed it away. So that's
transactional.
The one thing, it's transactional. It's a tragedy of the commons. You want to use those sort of economic terms. Like everyone has a reason to erode a little bit of it or someone else's for their own personal ends, but every time they do that, they erode it for everyone, which is a difficult thing. It's like putting up street cameras. We know we live in South Africa, massive crime. putting up a street camera is good to stop crime, but at the same time, it means that if you are, say, trapped in a bad marriage and you've got an abusive husband, he's able to spy on you now. So there's always the con there. And when it comes to saying why privacy matters, I've actually the chapter in the book that I've got coming out with a bunch of other futurists I wrote was on exactly that, why we need privacy. And there's a commercial reasons for it and personal reasons. But the easiest way to articulate it is that you want to invest in your privacy or to retain your privacy, assuming the worst case scenario that happens. So you can think about it. You might live in a democracy now, but what happens if your state becomes more totalitarian in the future? What happens if you want to engage in anything that requires social change? Because social change is never popular. So what if you want to lobby for anything to change any law in your country? And as soon as you start doing that, you've got enemies. And your enemies, of course, will look for anything that can erode your credibility, whether it is just the way you spoke to your baby sister on Facebook. It says, oh no, she's actually a horrible person, or whether it's an illicit relationship you had that's got nothing to do with your job, whatever it is. We've all got secrets, and we've all got something that can be construed in a way that could cause you harm if you had enemies. Now, most of us think we don't have enemies, but if you end up living in a country with a bad government, what if you ended up living in a country that's going the direction Germany was going in the 1920s? Mm-hmm. If you don't have privacy, you don't have you've outsourced your agency, and you've kind of lost a whole lot of those chips you could have used to get your family out safely or to negotiate something with someone in a position of power. Mm-hmm. But you've got to see it as sort of a bargaining chip going forward. But also there's many social reasons for like the right to be forgotten. Like you might think your opinions are entirely right today, but in 5 or 10 years time, the zeitgeist shifts and suddenly words that you were allowed to say previously, you're not allowed to say anymore.
You're being cancelled.
You're being cancelled. And it's not because your heart has changed or your intention has changed. It's rather that society has shifted, but it's refusing to forget. You've got no corners left. You've got no privacy left. But if you go sort of deeper into psychology, if you have nothing that is withheld from the rest of society, how do you distinguish between close relationships and sort of loose ties? And how do you even know who you are if everything about you is sort of outsourced in the sort of Ethernet or the collective brain, and there's nothing left just for you? That's like a loss of identity crisis, you see. And we see this quite a lot already. Mm-hmm. But there's so many reasons why withholding some things back of you are useful for your insanity, but also more as a sort of insurance policy against a future that you don't really have control over. You don't know how society is going to shift, and you don't know what can be used against you at some point in time. But if you want a commercial argument, we can look at economics very, very nicely. So like economics 101 is like, supply and demand meet on that lovely, lovely chart over there. In a perfectly balanced, totally free market with no monopoly, supply and demand meet, but they meet, that also means you got no profit, okay? Mm-hmm. So because that's a perfectly balanced market, like goods are traded exactly as is. There's no profit, there's no margin. Margin is in the mystery, if you want to put it that way. And the mystery in a sort of commercial sense is things like trade secrets or brand love or, irrationalities, most of which require some degree of secrecy. But like you don't have to necessarily call it secrecy. You could also call it like an imbalance of information. And you might think, oh, that's naughty. We shouldn't be like have imbalance of information. But if we don't have imbalance of information, there's essentially no value left to trade in marketplaces. So I think the people that are engaged in any sort of business understand that secrecy, even the secrecy is, where you get your paint from, or, who does the writing for your website. It's those little bits of secret that give you a competitive edge, and you can apply that to personal lives too. But anyway, many ways to look at why privacy is worth it as a value, but I think it's also worth it from a sort of sanity point of view, like for society at large. There is such a thing as knowing too much about everyone else. It's not helpful.
For sure. And talking about exchange, you just alluded to exchange. Let's talk about the game stonks caper, the Reddit situation. It was pretty fun that Reddit users took to Wall Street and they invested in GameStop stocks. It's always been difficult to say that. It's a bit of a tongue twister.
Yeah, it's terrible.
This just happened now at the end of January of 2021. And basically it reveals some reassuring things, because something I like about the talks I've seen you give and videos of you online is you're very diplomatic in how you approach certain things, but I think you're also you don't really fluff anything up. Like, you know, you're very realistic about certain things, and I think that's a good quality to have. So you don't necessarily always blackball people and make them all doom and gloom and depressed, because I think there are many ways to interpret where we're headed as pretty negative. But that's all about framing and communication and all that. But what this tells us is that the citizenry do not want elites to control their lives. I think the majority of people will agree to that. But if you look on Twitter for maybe just 15 minutes on a day, you'll see the narrative that people are saying, no, but people are relinquishing these freedoms and these rights all the time. So how can you say that they don't want the elites in control of them? So because they're willingly giving away power. So what this GameStop situation reveals to me is that a certain subset of people don't want elites controlling every aspect of their lives, but it also reveals something, like you said, people are waking up. The game is rigged. I mean, in most aspects, this game is rigged, and it has been for a very long period of time. And these
it's not a free market, no.
no, not at all. Yeah, no, not at all. But what it also shows is that these tech firms, again, that invisible force. Now I'm just seeing the whole flow of what you presented. So the tech firms and platforms are appearing to work in lockstep with Wall Street hedge funds, and, you know, banning people from buying and selling stocks, for instance, on Robinhood. And then communication channels were shut down. The Discord servers for Wall Street Bets, which was the subreddit that was kind of initiating and spurring on this movement, that was shut down. So they couldn't even meet in private to discuss their intentions. So I don't know, there's a pattern in this. Can you maybe tell us more about this pattern, Bronwyn?
Yeah, well, I did nominate at the beginning of this year. I decided that this year, 2021, is the year of resisting centralization, and we're seeing lots of things there. So I mean, you can see like how crypto has had its day, like what happens there. Who knows? I've got more complicated thoughts on that, but that's a different conversation. But it's evidence of a certain degree of resistance. The whole like succession movements that are like gathering speed across the world, also indications that people want to break away from centralized control. And then, of course, as you said, this whole like Reddit Wall Street beats thing. I'm slightly more cynical about that whole thing than you are, because essentially what I saw there was a class war between the 10% and the 1%, which is also both, they're two elite strata of society. And it's more of a symptom of the bigger division between the people that are really getting screwed over by the rigging of the market, which is people that don't have enough money to even bet on Wall Street bets. You know, like there's many more people that are below that surface. And we're kind of seeing it's not the big guy versus the little guy. It's the big guy versus the slightly less big guy that's struggling there. But it's very indicative of a society that is at a crisis point, because if you look through history, most revolutions have been between the upper middle class or the bourgeoisie and the ruling class. It's an upper class struggle that actually sort of drives history forward. It was also interesting for you to point out that many people are still ceding over control. In fact, people are begging to be led, often literally, like, please take away my rights because I don't want responsibility over my future. And that is a more prevalent narrative at the moment than the resistance narrative, but I am encouraged to see that the resistance narrative is still there. Because that's the other thing with resistances, it only takes a couple of people to drive change. This is the thing. It takes a lot of courage to be the first guy to throw a rock or to stand up or to refuse to sit down. It takes much less courage to be the second guy. And Paul Graham, you know, the investor, Y Combinator, all the rest of it, he has quite an interesting essay that I keep on referring back to about sort of dividing people's attitude to control and authority essentially into sort of 4 quadrants, saying people that are anti-authority, people that are pro-authority, and then people that are passive and people that are active. And he says that most people are simply just passive. Most people just simply don't care enough, you know, so they'll sort of follow the prevailing narrative. And then you've got a larger subset that actually wants to impose more control over other people. And this is a dominant narrative. And in fact, throughout history, there's been many more people have tried to tell other people what to do than have resisted against that. The much smaller segment is, of course, people that are both sort of anti the prevailing status quo and active enough to actually do something about it, rather than just sort of, mildly roll their eyes or complain every now and again. But the encouraging thing is it doesn't take many in order to facilitate that change. It just really needs to be someone to sort of put a wedge in the door before it snaps entirely shut. This is what we have to understand about any sorts of liberties or about any sort of erosions of freedom. And erosions of freedom I definitely include here are the rigging of our stock markets and the rigging of our central banks and the way they create absolute rampant inequality and theft from the poor to the very elite connected classes. Those are all erosions of freedom and the ability for people to operate under their own agency. We've got to just be very careful that we leave room for that before that door gets entirely closed, and it doesn't take much resistance to expose the cracks. Encouraging things are that conversations are happening. So whether it was a sort of great WhatsApp exodus or the Wall Street bet sort of drama of January 2021, those are all indications that people are starting to at least understand where the issues are. Even if the people are not en masse acting against it, just that basic education level as to where the problems are is at least a starting point, so people can make more informed, consent-based decisions going forward, which is my whole general thing working in the future space, is to give people agency over their own futures. And that comes in two parts. Firstly, belief that what you actually do can make a difference. And that's why the WhatsApp story and the Wall Street bet story are great, because it proves that small people can facilitate change. So you have to give people back the belief that trying is worth it. And you see this in democracy. Young people become apathetic voters. They don't even bother to vote. It's because they don't believe their agency matters. We have to change that. Otherwise, people do become passive. And the second thing is, of course, to make sure that people not understand that their agency does matter, they actually use it. They choose to use it rather than to hand it on to the next person. And that's sort of a motivation issue. But I think the first one is, of course, reinstilling some sort of belief that we have some sort of agency or free will over our own lives. If you don't have that, then you might as well just sit back and, accept some sort of inevitable predisposed future from the richest or loudest or most powerful guy in the room, which is quite depressing.
Anecdotally, I heard a story. Apparently it's compulsory to vote in the elections in Australia. Is that true or not? Apparently,
there's a few places there are.
Apparently it's compulsory to vote there, but still the turnout is only like 80%. So it shows you
you can't really enforce that.
That even if something is compulsory, there's always that passive sort of blasé-ness about it.
There's always a passive contingent. Yes, there's always people that would rather not.
Yeah,
rather
100%.
Not participate. But you want to minimize that as much as possible, because that's the only way you get sort of divergent futures instead of convergent ones. And I think that's generally, if you look at the arc of human history, generally the mission for people that do care about the future has been to avoid a totalizing future of any sort. Like whether that was the sort of Roman idea of empire or the British idea of empire or the sort of Soviet idea of sort of, fully automated communism everywhere, whatever it is, we want to avoid totalizing futures, because any utopia is horribly depressing, because it's inescapable. If it is if it is perfected, it becomes very, very imperfect. So
moreover, this isn't a zero-sum game either. So I think that's I think
we should be working to multiple options ahead rather than trying to converge on one thing. And I think that's also where a lot of political drama comes on board, because it's like either it's our view or it's your view. Like why can't we have a bit of everything? Why can't we have more different small nations and everyone can try their thing and move from one part to another? That's a much more exciting sort of idea of what could be happening, rather than trying to get everyone to agree on one future for everyone, which is where your institutions like your World Economic Forum raise quite a few eyebrows, because they're trying to impose a particular worldview that suits a lot of people, but also hugely doesn't suit a whole lot of other people. And trying to impose one homogenous future is generally a warning sign of problems going ahead.
So what does a decentralized internet look like to you?
Well, we had a decentralized internet.
Yeah, that's true.
This was like the original internet. What's happening right now is that we are centralizing the internet by breaking it apart. So that does sound a little bit like tautologist. It sounds like I'm contradicting myself, but instead of having an entirely sort of wild west of an internet. Essentially what's happening now is that we're getting basically nationalized and regionalized versions of the internet that are each controlled at a single point of failure. So that's the problem. The problem really is that the internet has become more centralized, not that it needs to be decentralized. And unfortunately, when you start using those words decentralized, some people see that as being broken into pieces, which is not decentralizing. That's
fracturing.
Balkanizing better. So you're sort of building little citadels around it, which is where we're tending. Like the decentralized internet exists. We've forgotten why it exists and what its values are. So I definitely encourage people to kind of read old Tim Berners-Lee and his original sort of vision for the World Wide Web and all of that, because the idea there really was not to centralize it. But what's happened is over time, we've had sort of regulatory creep. It's much like taxation. It's always temporary until it's permanent, right?
Oh, wow.
And it never gets less. It always gets more, right? And regulation, you never get less regulation. You always just get another one added on, another one added on. So, we've added all these things. Then there's filters in the EU, and then there's pop-ups that you have to submit your cookies on this over here. And like all these things, little pockets of centralization that are essentially fragmenting our once wild World Wide Web into a much less exciting thing. I mean, like some futurists sort of see that eventually every nation has their own internet that's controlled with its own rules as to what sites are allowed and all the rest of it. But at the same time, the more you try and sort of control these things, there's always deeper and darker layers that we can go to rebuild rebuild new decentralized versions. And of course, what people are trying to do on the back of some of the sort of the crypto space to build a fully crypto internet that will be as decentralized as the currencies that sort of inspire the whole initiatives. It's essentially trying to go back to what was, which is quite ironic.
Yeah, the states are trying to get their finger in that crypto pie so badly. I can see the moves that are happening everywhere around the world. I mean, they're trying to regulate crypto. I mean, doesn't that defeat the entire purpose?
Well, you should go watch my Heavy Chef talk on that, because I see we're going to be talking forever. But essentially, you've got a conflict. You've got a very big conflict between international private borderless money and basically democracy in the nation state. They're incompatible because a nation state is premised on a social contract, and a social contract requires contributions. It requires people paying taxes as protection money. That's what it essentially boils down to. It's the simplest way to describe what a nation state is. And if you've got people that have an opportunity not to contribute to the payment side of that equation while still trying to enjoy the benefits of nice things like property rights, which often libertarians seem to forget don't exist unless you've got a state that enforces them, right? You know, you gotta remember that. You've got nice things that come with borders and law and order, as well as nasty things like too much centralization. And essentially crypto breaks that contract if it gets big enough. So you've got two versions that countries try to adopt there. The one is strong states that have, as I tried to articulate earlier, the whole Wi-Fi curtain that has snapped entirely shut, like China. You can own crypto in China. They can't shut down a private borderless international currency level, but they can prevent you from using that cash for anything that matters within China, and they can prevent you leaving the country with it. So you can have $1 billion in Bitcoin in China. If in 5 years' time, no one's allowed in or out that Wi-Fi curtain, it's essentially useless to you. You won't be able to use it to buy property, to buy a car, to pay rent. I mean, because all the rest of the money is surveillance money, which is, like central bank digital currencies. So that's just basically surveillance cash. And that's strong states. But weaker states, of course, won't be able to plug those gaps. Weaker states have a different problem, which isn't that people will be entirely sort of subject to a very surveilled system, rather that social contracts accelerate the breakdown very, very quickly. So taking South Africa, where you've already got massive inequality, you've got on the one hand, massive growing demand for entitlements and welfare payments that are required so people can survive. I mean, you can't take these things away. People have to eat. And at the same time, you've got even your middle class or anyone that's able to earn money is able to essentially use crypto rails to, as capital flows. It doesn't matter if South Africa then imposes a central bank digital currency if they're not able to stop those flows physically. If they don't have a full 360-degree Wi-Fi curtain, they can't monitor all those on-ramps and off-ramps, and you'll just see more capital move out of the country, which is sort of accelerates vicious and virtuous circles on rich get richer, poor get poorer. It leads to conflict in the real world, so physical conflict, which is what we should be concerned about here. So crypto is many things. It is, like all technologies, quite amoral, and it's a chaotic system. It breaks a lot of things that we have. And I think that people that are seriously involved in the space, my challenge to you is to think about the real world and think about how you are going to protect yourself, your property, and your community if at the same time you're trying to break it.
Yeah.
Because it does break it. It breaks the nation state. It breaks democracy. Is that a price you are willing to pay? I'm quite ambivalent as to that. I'd like to see a world full of tiny micronations rather than big United States. So this just suits me. But for a lot of people, I know that's a minority opinion. I don't want my worldview imposed upon everyone else. And like we've got to sort of choose if we want to sort of neo-feudal, new dark age, or if we want to be very conscious about redefining our social contracts in ways that are more helping more people to get more of what they want, that are less rigged. So there's challenges to people on all sides of the debate there, but crypto is hugely destabilizing. And we might have seen how it can destabilize financial systems. We have not understood how it's going to disrupt physical societies quite yet. That's going to be the next very interesting 10 to 20 years.
Well, we'll be looking forward to that. I really like your concept of the Wi-Fi curtain, and I think I'm going to be using it quite a bit because I mean it goes beyond just describing infrastructure requirements. I really like the connotations and everything you brought with it. I will have a follow-up conversation with you to expand on that. But for now, I want to thank you for your time, Bronwyn. I have a couple last questions that will just like quick fire, quick questions just to get more, flesh you out a bit more for the audience. So let's see, coffee or tea?
Coffee in the morning, tea in the afternoon.
All right. Star Wars or Star Trek?
Neither, thanks.
Great choice. I agree. Zombie apocalypse or alien invasion?
I'm going with the aliens.
Cool. I'm down with that as well. Laptop or desktop PC?
Laptop, eh?
Okay.
Smaller the better.
Windows, Mac OS or Linux?
Mac at the moment. But ideologically, I'm pro Linux, but I'm just not quite that energetic. So I'm revealing my weak inner core here. But my ideals don't live up to my reality.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a graphic designer, so it's like I use Mac and I get tar and feathered for it all the time. But anyway, I just enjoy it more for that purpose. But the final question for you, Bronwyn, today is hamburgers or pizza?
Pizza.
Okay. Well, again, I agree with you. Yeah, my wife would also agree. She's a cheese fiend. Bronwyn, where can the audience find you? Where can they follow you? And where can they find more details about your book?
Okay, so I'm a partner of Flux Trends. It's quite well known. So fluxtrends.com, you can see what we do there on the trend space. But if you want to hear like crazy talk like you heard today, then you should probably head over to my personal website, which is bronwynruthwilliams.com, Ruth in the middle there. And yeah, otherwise you can find me quite easily on Twitter where all those links are. As for the book, what we've done is with a bunch of 20 futurists from all across the world, we've put together a book that is to get other people involved in futures, because quite frankly, we are kind of sick of the futures sort of faculty or fraternity being quite elitist and full of jargon and all the rest of it, because future doesn't belong to people that have got degrees in foresight. It's up to everyone to take back their agency. So anyway, we've written 20 very different essays. I don't agree with at least half of them in the book. So,
that's how you know it's good.
Very diverse in our opinions. Yeah. Everyone's written about an issue that they think that everybody should be thinking about when it comes to the future. So it ranges from everything from things like universal basic income to, as I mentioned, privacy to, the future of genetic inequality and all the rest of it. And the essays have been written by the futurists that we know, but they're supposed to be used as conversation starters to say, like, what do you think about this? And what are you going to do about it if you don't like it? So hopefully it gets people talking about the future, and if not excited about it, at least angry enough to do something about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. I'll be speaking to you soon. Hopefully we can do a follow-up, or we can do more of these if you're keen. But I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for agreeing to this.
Thank you very much. Anytime.